All right, picking up where we left off. Sorry, you're cut off mid-sentence about the Puritans. So this is part two of our introduction to literature of the 17th and 18th centuries. Anyway, Puritans um, emphasized a personal relationship with God and direct contact with the Bible rather than ritual and clergy mediation between the congregation and its God and Scripture. So because they emphasized that personal relationship with the Bible, they very much cared about education in terms of reading and writing because they couldn't have a personal relationship with the Bible unless they themselves could read the Bible. Now, the Roman Catholic Church, on the other hand, very much inserted the priest into that relationship between person and Bible. So the priest was in the middle. And in fact, most people weren't allowed to read from the Bible themselves, and often the Bible was printed in Latin, as were church services. Church services were delivered in Latin. So how much could these people understand if they didn't know Latin? How much could they understand if they couldn't read? So the Puritans said, you know what? The Bible was put here for us to be able to be righteous and to live a righteous life. And we cannot figure that out unless we read it for ourselves. And we don't want any priest to get in between us and God or us and the scriptures, because then the priest has the power to change things according to whatever the priest wants, right? There's a certain power that comes in being the only source for religious instruction. And so the Puritans said, nope, we need to get rid of that. We've seen too many abuses by priests, like the selling of indulgences and all sorts of things that go on, like the church trying to have a holy war, or the churches trying to take people's property and make lots of money. So anyway, that the Puritans said, we need to purify this. And the only way we can purify it is if we read the Bible ourselves, understand what the Bible says, and then return to those basic principles that are in the Bible. So Puritans very much felt impelled to read and write, right? They wanted to be able to know how to read and write. And so they permitted people to be educated. So this is a huge shift, all right? And this is part of the reason women started to be able to read and write more, not only because of the printing press, but also these Puritans that emphasized people being literate, learning how to read, learning how to write, and being able to read books for themselves, especially the Bible, so that they could figure out what God wanted them to do and return to those basic principles that they felt that not only the Roman Catholic Church, but also the Church of England had corrupted. Anyway, Puritans did not like what they considered to be the excesses of James I's reign. And because of their agitations, that James was being too excessive, he was being too luxurious, too indulgent, James restricted the religious freedom of the Puritans. Such persecution caused the Puritans to seek out a new land for themselves, a land where they would be free to practice religion as they saw fit. This land took the form of America. First, they went to the Netherlands, but after finding out they weren't happy in the Netherlands because people would mock them and taunt them there, they returned to England. And in England, they decided that they had heard about this new world where England was taking over territory. So they decided, what? We'll go there. We'll establish ourselves there. And there's no one there yet, really. I mean, there are some people there, right? But not that many. There's not like this established government and laws that are, really in place, right? So I figured we can go there and do whatever we want, right? We can have whatever freedoms we feel important, and we can worship as we please. We can set up our own church. Anyway, that's exactly what they did. In 1620, the Pilgrims, who were a puritanical religious sect of dissenters from England, they set sail from Plymouth, England, in the Mayflower, and they arrived in Massachusetts and established themselves there. Thus, religious change and the English language planted themselves in the New England area of America, paving the way for such 17th and 18th century writers as Anne Bradstreet, Phyllis Wheatley, and Abigail Adams, all of whom we read about this week. Meanwhile, back in England, James I's son and successor, Charles I, actually married a Roman Catholic from France. The Stuart family was already at odds with the Puritans and the British Parliament because the Stuart kings spent extravagantly and asserted themselves as divine absolute monarchs, having to answer to no one, including Parliament. Fed up with this foreign Scottish king, because remember I told you he's king of Scotland and he's king of England, which hadn't happened to this point, where those countries actually shared the same monarch. So, unless, like England invaded Scotland and like took over for a while, but then you'd always see Scotland reassert itself. So anyway, the king was allied with France through his wife and Catholicism because France was still very much Catholic. And they disregarded the Parliament. So the Puritans rose up and they, believe it or not, they actually beheaded King Charles I in 1649. Yeah, not too long ago. The British, largely driven by the Puritans, actually beheaded their own king. And you think, what? This is a religion trying to purify itself? And they go and commit murder? But, a lot is done, right? For religious freedoms. And, and also they thought that he was not cooperating with Parliament and he was spending extravagantly. Interestingly, James I, Charles I's father, was the one who made the King James Bible. He felt very impelled that England, I can't remember if James I became king either in 1601 or 1603, but thereabouts, right at the beginning of the 1700s, or right at the beginning of the 1600s, or the 17th century. But soon thereafter, he had put together the most well-researched, well-translated version of the Bible to that point. He gathered all the old records and got all the scholars together and tried to get as much information as possible to make as accurate a translation of the Bible into English as possible. So that is where we get the King James Version of the Bible. All right, anyway, this turmoil where the Puritans, or they're also known as the Roundheads because they had their hair all cut like a round circle around their head, so they were nicknamed the Roundheads. Anyway, where they beheaded the king and fought against, Parliament and things like that. This was called the English Civil War. And it replaced the monarchy of England with the Commonwealth of England. So when they took over, they abolished the monarch and set up a form of government called a Commonwealth, all right, where they were led by a Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, and also a parliament of their own choosing. Hence, the religious and political upheaval that marked the 17th and 18th centuries in both England and America. So, a lot of religious and political upheaval. Now, during the British Commonwealth, the Puritans actually shut down the theaters in England. Interesting, right? Because we've just finished the period of Shakespeare, and all these great playwrights. I mean, there were other playwrights in addition to Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, but of course Shakespeare was the most dominant, right? And it was like this theatrical renaissance. Well, not too long after that, the Puritans took over and they shut down the theaters. They took over in 1649, right? And so there was no longer able to be any theater watched in England. All right, it was illegal to act on stage. So, anyway, Puritans, they valued education and personal religious experience, but they disdained shows of material wealth, ritual, and embellishment, which, you see that goes hand in hand with the theater, right? Is you have people acting in costumes and, seems like it's a luxury to go to the theater and things like that. Hence, poetry lost the ornamentation popular in the Baroque verse of James I and Charles I's times. They had a simpler form of language and poetry during this time being preferred. Also, writings tended to become very didactic. Didactic means very teachy or preachy. Like instead of being like, oh, isn't this a wonderful life we're leading? And wow, we're running through the fields and, all these complex metaphors. Instead, it became like very much into like teaching religion and teaching the way to live and an emphasis on education and moral edification. The importance of personal spiritual experience also encouraged personal autobiographical writings too. So because there was so much emphasis on, I've got to have my religious experience for myself. I have to read the Bible for myself. I have to pray. I have to have my own personal relationship with God and the Bible. And so that led to people recording their own spiritual conversion and their own thoughts and things like that to kind of get at the heart of what was considered now the important relationship between person and God and the scriptures. So these autobiographical writings that were very personal became much more in vogue. The harsh conditions Puritans were confronting just to stay alive in New England contributed also to a certain sense of ruggedness, lack of communication, and lack of refinement in the writings composed there. So no ornamentation, communication. They had a lot of communication back with England. It was difficult, right? So sometimes their language would shift away a little bit. And that's how you get, the accent of that like New England area being distinct from the rest of the United States, but also being distinct from England. All right, so the Puritans' reign became too zealous, militaristic, and unstable for the people of England, who in 1660 replaced the Commonwealth with a monarchy again. So that Commonwealth only lasted from 1649 to 1660. So only about 11 years, all right? And then people were like, I'm done with this. We need a change. Let's go back to that monarch thing again. Now, this restoration of the monarch restored the Stuart line of kings to the throne of England in the person of Charles II, who was the son of beheaded Charles I. All right, so they killed Charles I, so he wasn't around anymore to become monarch again, so they got his son, Charles II. He became King of England. Interesting, they went back to what they had, right? The grass is always greener, huh? Anyway, the theaters reopened. This is known as it's a great period of the Restoration is known for its excesses and indulgences because people were so tired of of being deprived during the Commonwealth that they wanted stuff again. They wanted theater. They wanted all those indulgences they had been deprived of. So the theaters reopened. Women were even allowed for the first time ever to perform on the British stage. You know that during Shakespeare's time and right afterwards and prior to Shakespeare's time, women were not allowed to perform on stage in England. So all those parts that were written for women during Shakespeare's time, they were actually played by boys whose voices hadn't changed yet so that they could imitate women. Yeah. Isn't that funny? The transvestite played not that the actors themselves were transvestites, but it was men or boys, like teenage boys whose voices hadn't changed yet, dressed up as women on stage. So Juliet in Romeo and Juliet would have been played by a boy. So this creates a lot of interesting dynamics, right? We got transvestism on the stage, and I don't know, like if people ever kissed on the stage, but that could have been interesting for people to watch, knowing that relationships were pretty traditional at the time, pretty traditional definitions of gender too, male, female relationships. So it's kind of interesting when you think back about that and wonder, hey, what did people think about that? Anyway, women were finally allowed to be on stage, so they could finally play female parts during this restoration that started in 1660 and moved forward. So, in reaction to the prudish, zealous Puritans, Charles II's monarchy was Catholic, decadent, and even sexually licentious. The theaters were reopened, and women were even allowed for the first time ever to perform on the British stage, as I said. However, political parties first emerged in England during Charles II's reign. The Tories, the Tory party, they supported the aristocracy and the autocracy of the monarchy, and the Whigs sided with business interests and the middle class. So those are the first political parties during this time, or ever, right, in England's history. So upon Charles II's death, his brother James II ascended the throne of England. However, the British people soon tired of the Catholic and